Here of our extended history family in Haifa. He has a postdoc for this, and next year, if I understood it right, at the Center for Mediterranean History. Dr. Dylan James did his PhD at Oxford, and he's going to work on a topic here in Haifa that's a little bit broader than his talk today. As I understand it, it's all about indigenous guides. We're very happy to have you. It will be very interesting, I'm sure. The floor is yours. And
okay, well, thank you so much, Stefan. Can everyone hear me on Zoom? Yes, okay. Well, I'll just share my screen here. Is that coming up?
Also choose a slide presentation mode below on the right.
Where am I looking here? Sorry, this is classic Zoom.
Yeah, here.
That then?
No, here.
Okay. Well, let's get back to right, we'll do that again. All right. Well, yes, thank you everyone for coming today in person and on Zoom. Thanks to Stefan and the History Department for inviting me to speak, and to Gil and Zur and Ori and Shiri and everyone in the Center for Mediterranean History for making me feel very welcome since I arrived about a month ago. It's good to be here in person. So, stranded in the middle of Asia, around 400 BC, the Greek mercenaries, known as the 10,000, were in despair, surrounded by enemies, far from Greek territory, and as Xenophon tells us, with no local guide, no hegemon, to lead them. This passage, like many others in Greco-Roman historiography, highlights the centrality of indigenous local guides for Greek and Roman military activity in foreign lands. Yet to my knowledge, no major dedicated study of these figures exists. There are many reasons for this, not least the traditional scholarly focus on political elites and great man history, which of course tends to follow the focus of the ancient sources themselves, especially with Alexander. And therein lies the crux. The sources don't always give us the information that we want about so-called minor figures like guides. They're typically anonymous, mentioned in passing, or just when they happen to royally screw up or surprise someone or get punished, or when someone really regrets not having one, like Xenophon. So what creative approaches can we use to deal with this historiographical situation? And this is a central question for my postdoc project here at the Haifa Center for Mediterranean History. The project examines indigenous guides in Greco-Roman historiography and ancient Mediterranean history. While I'm not explicitly dealing with the Mediterranean today, the methodological approach I'm going to be discussing will be central to the wider project and has significant ramifications for our evaluation of Mediterranean history. So this paper is something of a meditation on methodology, specifically comparative history and its application to antiquity. What value is there in comparing ancient and modern contexts? Can we employ the fuller documentation that comes with modern historical contexts to illuminate our more limited evidence from antiquity? Is this inherently anachronistic, as some scholars think? What other pitfalls are there with such an approach? What are the benefits? Classical scholars and other subfields, like ancient slavery, have been engaging with these questions and demonstrating the value of comparative historical approaches for a long time. I want to explore its potential for studying ancient guides. So today, first I shall briefly review previous examples of this kind of ancient modern comparative approach, or rather modern ancient comparative approach. Then more specifically, we'll have a quick look through the work of Brian Bosworth and Alexander in the East, where he develops fruitful comparisons between the history and historiography of Alexander and Cortes in Mexico. And he also touches on guides and interpreters as one of his topics of interest. Then I shall offer my own case study I want to look at whether early contact in the Americas, specifically the historiography of Christopher Columbus's first voyage, can illuminate the role, agency, exploitation, and depiction of indigenous guides in antiquity, specifically Alexander's campaigns in India. My approach in many ways builds upon Bosworth's, who brought attention to the interconnectedness of encounters between the Macedonians and indigenous informants. Nobody in Alexander's studies seems to have taken up this comparative strand of Bosworth's work, and this is something I'm hoping to expand upon in the broader project, comparing material relating to guides from New World and other modern imperialistic contexts. Finally, I shall offer some conclusions about how best to employ this kind of comparative approach. So, like the New World for Columbus, much of this is new territory for me, so I'm looking forward to hearing what you'll have to say, and I'm particularly interested in constructive and collaborative dialogue going forward with anyone as I continue to develop this project. Okay, so what exactly am I talking about when I'm talking about comparative history? In thinking about ancient history, Vlasopoulos defines comparative history as scholarly works that compare an aspect or process in Greco-Roman antiquity with the equivalent phenomenon or process in another period or culture. This can involve comparing different contemporary societies, such as ancient Rome and ancient China, which has been a major recent focus, or comparing historical settings as far apart as Alexander and Columbus. Exactly what constitutes an equivalent phenomenon or process, of course, is up for debate, especially when comparing ancient and modern historical contexts. Some may argue that there can be no such equivalence, and indeed many scholars still dismiss comparative history as inherently anachronistic. But the wealth of comparative ancient history in recent decades is making such a stance increasingly untenable. Comparative approaches to ancient slavery, for example, informed by the antebellum American South and the transatlantic slave trade, have borne significant fruit. Certainly, there are pitfalls with any comparative approach, especially when too much emphasis is placed on the comparative material. Conclusions must still be grounded in the ancient evidence. In this regard, I find Roger Bagnall's perspective useful. So I'm just going to check that there's no one complaining that they can't hear me. Okay. In this regard, I find Roger Bagnall's perspective useful. In discussing the utility of comparing Ptolemaic Egypt and modern colonial contexts, he argues that the primary benefit is the, quote, imaginative enrichment of our readings of ancient texts. He says it's precisely the informing of the imagination that is at the heart of the gains realizable from this sort of comparative study. The surviving ancient documents, after all, record only some aspects of life, leaving others barely mentioned. If we know what we're looking for, we can sometimes find indirect traces of it in documentation created for some entirely different purpose. And to know what we're looking for, we're dependent on the enrichment of our imagination about human experience. Similarly, Vlasopoulos argues that comparative history can allow us to test the limits of the possible, the historical possibility and plausibility of our hypotheses and models. These perspectives reflect what has been called the soft use of comparative evidence. In Padilla Peralta's words, its purpose is not so much to delineate rigorous comparisons and contrasts, but to generate a set of new questions and alternative exegeses, even if the questions cannot be answered definitively, and even if the alternatives prove insusceptible to final verification or falsification. So in short, it's less about filling in gaps and more about asking new questions. To my knowledge, this kind of approach has only been applied to Alexander or ancient guides once by Brian Bosworth in Alexander in the East, A Tragedy of Triumph. In that study, Bosworth compared Cortez's conquest of Mexico, expecting to find similarities of mindset between the two conquerors and their cultural and social isolation. He hit a dead end. But he writes, if the analogy did not work in macrocosm, it certainly did in microcosm. He found many, quote, similarities of detail, which he considered, quote, parallel manifestations of universal phenomena, all the more impressive and that in that they are so separated in time and cultural context. For our purposes, his comparative work is especially illuminating in terms of the universal phenomena of information exchange between imperialists and indigenous peoples. Bosworth notes the parallels in the problems of oral translation through multiple interpreters, each with their own cultural knowledge and agenda. A famous example from Alexander's expedition has an Indian wise man, Dandamas, complaining to a Greek inquirer that asking for a clear explication of his philosophical thought through 3 interpreters was like expecting water to flow clear through mud. Bosworth argues that this anecdote takes on much more significance when we compare the role of interpreters on Cortez's expedition. Cortez employed 2 chief interpreters, a Spaniard, Aguilar, who knew the Mayan tongue, and an enslaved indigenous woman, Malinche, or Doña Marina, to the Spanish, who knew Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. And if we just go back, that's Malinche on the right, next to Cortez. Both interpreters were Christian. Malinche had embraced the religion soon after being captured, and this affected their translations. The Aztec ruler Montezuma, as corroborated by several sources, denied being a god to his people with the following appeal. He said, "See that I am flesh and blood like you and all other men, and I am mortal and substantial." If that language rings a bell, then you might be recalling your New Testament. For example, Luke 24:39, "Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones, as ye see me have." Cortez's interpreters, aware of Spanish priorities, evidently translated Montezuma's words liberally to include a scriptural or biblical coloring. Montezuma also reportedly claimed that the Spaniards were the descendants of the founder of his own culture. But as Bosworth suggests, this must be the result of conscious deformation on the part of the interpreters. Malinche and Aguilar, quote, together gave Cortez the perfect justification for his Mexican adventure. Here, there was collusion between interpreters and employer. And these findings align with much modern thought on the interconnectedness of colonial encounters, that they transform all parties involved. In the Alexander context, Bosworth argues that this kind of distortion finds its way into Alexander's fascination and identification with Heracles and Dionysus. In his close reading of the sources, newly informed by the soft comparative use of the Mexican material, Bosworth found that Alexander's staff, quote, conveniently reinterpret local legends and integrate them into Greek mythology. Conversely, the native peoples supplied information which they thought would attract the interest and approval of their conquerors. The result was a growing conviction in Alexander's mind that he was following in the footsteps of Heracles and still more Dionysus. End quote. This kind of creation of belief, in Bosworth's phrase, would not be possible without complicity between Alexander and the indigenous guides. What Bosworth is getting at here is kind of similar to the concept of the cultural middle ground as first elucidated by Richard White in his study of the accommodations and relations that developed between Europeans and Native Americans in the Great Lakes region of North America between the mid-17th and early 19th centuries. When two cultures come into contact, their different backgrounds and beliefs about the other collide. The term middle ground describes spaces where cultural contact creates something new, especially when based on mutual misunderstandings. For Bosworth, comparison with Cortez's campaigns helped him bring these circumstances into sharper relief. As I've mentioned, no one seems to have followed in Bosworth's comparative footsteps in the realm of Alexander studies, but his work illustrates the potential for the study of guides. Indeed, scholars of many other historical contexts, especially modern imperial and colonial contexts, have recently been showing that the study of guides, informants, interpreters, and other go-betweens carries significant potential for understanding our sources, the ways information could be produced and manipulated, and the complexity of cultural interaction and agency within imperialistic contexts. Our ancient Greek and Roman sources don't provide as much detail as later periods, but the relationship between imperialist and indigenous guide in many respects transcends time and space, as Bosworth showed. Language barriers, cultural differences, inequalities of power all exist in almost any historical setting. So a passing reference in an ancient text to one aspect of this relationship may find a fuller counterpart in a more modern account, theoretically allowing for a more complex reading of the ancient source. So, to put these assumptions to the test, case study time. So my case study will compare indigenous guides and the historical sources for Alexander's campaigns in India and Columbus's first voyage to the Americas. Now, it's worth noting from the outset that beyond the vast temporal gulf between them, these two contexts do differ significantly in many key respects. Alexander, unlike Columbus, was not encountering entirely virgin territory, although the Greco-Macedonian world certainly did gain a lot of new information about geography, botany, and such, along with plenty of newly extracted wealth and newly colonized territory. The Indians Alexander encountered had dealt with foreign rulers before, as Darius I and other Achaemenid Persian kings had previously laid claim to 3 Indian satrapies. Nevertheless, the processes of navigation, cultural contact, and subjugation are broadly comparable, and indeed Columbus did not necessarily believe himself to be in virgin territory either. To the end of his life, he was convinced he'd arrived at a part of Asia. What about the influence of antiquity on Columbus himself? He was certainly well read in many ancient texts. He knew his Virgil, Seneca, Ptolemy's geography, and Pliny the Elder's natural history. It's not clear whether he saw himself as identifying in any way with Alexander. They did have Asia in common after all. We know Columbus read Plutarch's Life of Alexander, and given the contemporary popularity of the Alexander romance, he's likely to have read that as well. Certainly, Queen Isabella of Castile, one of Columbus's bosses, compared Columbus to Alexander in 1495. In her view, both Columbus and Alexander, quote, subjugated the East more to expound the doctrine of human life to his subjects than from a greedy ambition for kingdoms. And this is a perspective that, to be fair to her, still holds sway in some more conservative quarters. Now, I'm not yet greatly familiar with scholarship on classical reception in Columbus's diaries and letters, though this is certainly something I would like to explore more in future. So I'd be interested if anyone has any perspectives on the ways in which such classical reception might affect my readings in this paper. Okay. Now, in 2020, I published an article based on a single passage of Arrian's Indica, which is a text written in the 2nd century CE, but based chiefly on the lost account of Alexander's admiral Nearchus, which described his voyage from India to Persia in 325 to 324 BCE. Let's have a read of this passage now. Nearchus says that from there, a place called Mazana, a guide for the voyage sailed with them, a Gadrosian by the name of Hydrarchus. Hydrarchus undertook to take them as far as Carmania. From this point, there were no longer difficulties, but places were named or identified to a somewhat greater extent as far as the Persian Gulf. My article started out trying to understand the textual dilemma malonti onomad zomina, places were named, identified to a somewhat greater extent. Ultimately, I ended up using the textual debate as a jumping off point to explore the depiction and role of local guides in Nearchus's work and Alexander's expedition more broadly. I employed some parallels with Columbus and other early contacts in the Americas, following Bosworth's example, but I don't think I fully appreciated the value of this approach in that article. There was more to it than the simple observation of parallels. The comparative material was steering me in new directions, as it were. So the chief problem in this passage is that even when scholars believe the Greek text is correct, and several do not, they don't understand the point of mentioning naming. Typically, the relevant phrase has been translated in the sense of the coast already being better known, thus avoiding the naming present in the Greek onomadomina. They don't typically link it to the presence of the guide hierarchies, tending to talk about the coastline being better known to the Greeks from either Persian archives or mythological tradition. In the article, I argued that the text should be retained on the basis that identifying place names, in fact, was central to the role of local guides in relation to navigation, and thus the increased naming should be connected to the addition of the new guide. Now, it may seem an obvious role for a guide, perhaps, but no one had yet made this argument. One of the reasons I came to this argument was through my reading, my own kind of informal, casual reading of primary sources for Columbus's voyages, especially his first voyage. The sources for the first voyage consist primarily of two essentially identical public letters that Columbus wrote back to the Spanish monarchs in 1493, as well as the Diario del Primo Viaje, or the Diary of the First Voyage. Now, we don't actually have Columbus's original private diaries. They don't survive. What we call the diaries, the diarios, are in fact transcriptions of Columbus's journals made some decades later. Now, there was, of course, a long and complicated scholarly tradition around these sources, which we don't have time to go into today. But reading these primary sources, I was struck by how central place names were to Columbus's interests. But initially, I naively expected this interest to be a one-way street, all about imposing new Christian Spanish names on the discovered landscape. After all, that's what we get in his first public letter back to Spain in 1493, which begins with several new toponyms in honor of Christ and the Spanish royal family. He says, "To the first island which I found, I gave the name San Salvador in recognition of his heavenly majesty, who marvelously hath given all this. The Indians call it Guanahani. To the second, I gave the name Isla de Santa Maria de Concepcion. To the third, Ferrandina. To the fourth, La Isla Bella. To the fifth, La Isla Juana. And so to each one I gave a new name." The imposition of new Spanish names was evidently a key aspect of the public political picture of Columbus's activities in the New World. He does mention one indigenous Taino place name here, Guanahani, but the emphasis is strongly on the new names, and scholars have focused on the political intent of such colonizing discourse. So that's the public image, as it were. But in his more private diary, his diario, written for his own eyes and those of the Spanish royals, Columbus is much more interested in native Taino place names than I had expected. The very first toponym in the diary of the first voyage is the same Taino one from the letter, Guanahani. Daylight on Friday, October the 12th, when they arrived at the island of the Bahamas that was called in the Indians' tongue Guanahani. The new Spanish name he gave it, San Salvador, which we heard about in the public letter, only appears in the diary several days later on October 14th. Similarly, the Taino name Cuba is used repeatedly before the Spanish Juana, and of course, Cuba eventually won out. Throughout the diaries, we also encounter hybrid Taino-Spanish place names, which Columbus and his men created with the help of native informants. We have some examples on the slide here. So evidently, Columbus was greatly interested in learning indigenous toponyms. And this served a practical purpose, as one scholar, Gashauskate, argues. It helped mitigate the absence of adequate interpreters. Quote, "One part of speech served as a bridge for establishing a rudimentary kind of communication. Nouns, and in particular, proper names and place names, which were instrumental for asking questions about the local geography and for attempting to identify the places Columbus had reached." Compared to the public letter, the diary seemed to acknowledge more fully the effects that on-the-ground interaction with the indigenous Taino people had on Columbus's naming before he began his colonizing naming enterprise. How did he learn these names? In short, he enslaved local people. and we'll return to this. What did Columbus expect from his enslaved guides? One passage from the third day after landfall is quite revealing. He says, and those men whom I had captured made signs to me that the islands were so many that they could not be counted, and called by their names more than 100. And no island names are listed in the text, and scholars debate whether Columbus misunderstood what the captive men were saying. And this is, of course, most likely. He does acknowledge his ignorance elsewhere, although it doesn't stop him from interpreting their gestures and words creatively at times. But if it were a misunderstanding, then it's even more telling. The reference then reveals Columbus's conscious interest in learning place names in local languages. Columbus expected an Indigenous guide's goal to include or even focus on identification of local place names, and projected that expectation onto these guides. Their words, however misunderstood, had an indelible impact on the named landscape of the Americas. So reading Columbus enriched my imagination significantly, just as Bagnall said. And it made me wonder whether there could be similar connections in the ancient sources for Alexander's campaigns. And if so, could such connections help elucidate the odd passage from Arrian's Indica? So I went hunting for those indirect traces that Bagnall writes about. And with newly informed eyes, I began to find intriguing passages throughout the fragments of Nearchus's work, preserved especially in Arrian and Strabo. Now, there was great interest throughout the Greek world in place names from exotic locations, but we don't always hear about the processes involved in either learning or imposing these place names. Fortunately, Nearchus offers several explicit examples of this process of learning local toponymy from native informants. So I've got a few up here, but let's focus on the third passage. This includes a translation of a place name clearly obtained from locals through interpreters. He says, the harbor is large, circular, deep, and calm, but the entrance to it is narrow. In the local language, this is called the Women's Harbor, since the first ruler over this region was a woman. Now, if you're thinking that maybe there are other reasons why it might be called Women's Harbor, then I'm on it. I might be writing an article on a kind of Ionic interpretation of what was going on here. This kind of womb-like harbor. The acquisition of place names from indigenous informants is explicit in all these texts on the slide, but no doubt similar processes about which sources are silent would have been in operation for other place names too. In that respect, let's compare another example from Nearchus of a local naval guide, Mazzini's. He writes that the deserted island was called Organa, while the one where they anchored was called Oracta. The hipparch, the governor of this island, Mazzini's, sailed with them to Susa as a volunteer guide for the voyage. On this island, they, i.e. Macedonians, say that they were also shown the tomb of the first ruler of this territory. His name was Erythris, from which too came the name for the sea called Erythraeum. Now, Mazzini's, like Hydrarches, is a guide for the voyage, hegemon to plou. Now, as far as I can tell, this is a relatively uncommon technical term for a kind of temporary naval guide. But it's likely that Mazzini's was the source of the names of the islands Organa and Oracta, if not the etymology of the Erythraean Sea. Bosworth argues convincingly for another source for that name. But it's not difficult to imagine that Hydrarches provided a similar function, guiding and providing onomastic insight. But unlike Hydrarches, Mazzini's is a volunteer, ethellontes. The addition of this term immediately raises questions. Does the lack of it regarding Hydrarches imply that Hydrarches was unfree? Certainly, we'll soon see that Alexander himself enslaved indigenous individuals to employ as guides, like Columbus and others in the New World did. But the fact that we're told of Hydrarches' name and where he's from, he's Bedrosian, may tell against that. Unless his name means something like water guide, which might suggest an enslaved status, the Hydra, aspect, but that's something I need to look into further. It only occurred to me after I wrote the article. I suspect it's rather an issue of status or professional role. Mazzini's, as governor of the island, presumably didn't function as full-time guide and thus came aboard in a temporary voluntary capacity, though we certainly might explore just how freely that kind of decision was made. Nearchus and his men terrorized several communities along their coastal voyage, and the military reputation of Alexander had been spreading rapidly, of course, so local peoples likely knew well what was at stake. Hydrakes, on the other hand, seems to have functioned as a kind of professional guide, with expertise in a specific region, from Mosana to Carmania. Unfortunately, the evidence doesn't allow us to say much more, but again, we might question the extent of freedom in Hydrakes' decision to come aboard as well. Columbus's diaries and their rather blasé attitude to enslaving indigenous guides helps keep these issues of freedom and slavery at the forefront of our close reading of these ancient Greek sources, texts which often obscure such power relationships to an even greater degree. Another larger Nearchan fragment shows us Alexander himself enslaving guides, and it also illustrates the difficulties of finding guides, and more generally demonstrates how much Alexander depended on them. So Arrian describes Alexander's efforts in the Indus Delta, initially lacking guides. He says, without a guide for the voyage, that same term again, since the Indians of these parts had fled, the descent was rather difficult. The passing mention of fleeing Indians is a telling admission of the brutality of Alexander's behavior and his dependence on unfree labor. Columbus too mentions in passing that some of his enslaved guides escaped. For example, entry for October 15, 1492, talks about men leaping into the sea and fleeing like chickens. But returning to Alexander in the Indus, the navigational problems that arise from Alexander's lack of a guide for the voyage here also support my view that the difficulties that Kalepa experienced by Nearchus in our main passage were eased by Hydrakes' arrival later at Mosana and were indeed navigational. The next two passages on the slide and also on the handout showed further the use of guides, and it's clear at least that the troubles Alexander encountered on the Indus were alleviated by finding and enslaving local guides. We're then provided with a good example of the connection between such guides and knowledge of place names. Arrian writes, Alexander accordingly repaired these ships as best he could and sent men ahead down the river in 2 light gullies to investigate the island at which the locals said he would have to anchor on the voyage down to the sea. They said the island's name was Kaluta. It's evident that the guide's work providing directions also included local place names, whether from their own knowledge or that of indigenous informants. Nearchus' fragments show this clearly then, in examples well beyond the passage that started this investigation. Evidently, the indirect traces of complex cultural interactions between the Macedonians and indigenous Indian guides are indeed visible once we know what to look for. So the enrichment of the imagination provided by Columbus's accounts of his encounter with Taino peoples has illuminated our reading of Nearchus and allowed us to draw out some neglected details of the relationships between Alexander's men and local guides in India and the Persian Gulf. This includes the importance of identifying indigenous place names for navigation, but also a reminder to emphasize the power dynamics in these obscure relationships when we can discern them. Many of these guides were not free, arguably none, and this fact needs further examination. What agency can we determine in our analysis of these guides? How did their status affect the information they provided to Alexander? While Columbus has informed my approach to the Alexander sources, I don't think I've leaned too heavily on the comparative material. My conclusions remain grounded in the ancient evidence, and thus hopefully avoiding a key pitfall of comparative history as many see it. And this gets to what I think is the primary value of this soft comparative approach. It's not about filling in gaps by finding exact parallels, but about sensitizing us to a broader range of cultural behavior, of social interactions, and of human experience that allows us to ask different questions of the same ancient evidence. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dylan. We have plenty of time, and we also have comments I saw in the chat, perhaps. Or something to.
No questions yet.
Okay. So Dylan, you can manage.
Well, not an Alexander question, actually.
Not an Alexander.
Not an Alexander question, but one about methodology.
Okay.
And I want to address the issue of place names and power dynamics.
Mhm.
And I want to start this off by reading a little bit of Mark Twain from The Innocents Abroad. It's chapter 45.
Okay.
It goes on about things and says, of course, the real name of the place, after nightfall, we reached our tents just outside the nasty Arab village of Jonesboro. Of course, the real name of the place is El something or other, but the boys still refuse to recognize the Arab names or try to pronounce them. That's after Temnin El Foka or something is dubbed Jacksonville, some chapters before. And I'm wondering if you, there may be a few Alexander examples for this kind of thing. A lot of later places called Pella or getting Dion, Macedonian names in the Levant and in the East. But do you see in Alexander and in Cortez or Columbus these parallels for also like claiming ownership or maybe not bridging the strangeness, but accentuating it actually? Because if you call Terminal Foca Jonesboro, you sort of turn on the volume on the strangeness of things, I think.
You mean because it's a familiar name in a very foreign context?
In a very, exactly, the earlier, how does Twain put it? They call it Jacksonville. It sounds a little strangely here in the Valley of Lebanon, but it has the merit of being easier to remember than the Arabic name.
That's a good question. You know, obviously there's a ton of Alexandrias that come about, but mostly they're not getting built on existing foundations. But I mean, there's certainly some kind of, you might call it propagandistic naming, or there's an example in Arian where there's two local indigenous names for the river Tanais. There's the Oxantes, which is the, as far as I can tell, more local name, and then there's the Tanais. Both are not Greek, both are non-Greek names. The Tanais is apparently going back to an Iranian word for river, water. Like most rivers around the world, they tend to be named after what is happening there. And there's that the Macedonians draw a connection with the other Tanais near Scythia to imply, I can't remember the specifics of this, but they're implying a greater conquest by keeping that name at Tanais. So there's a kind of political reason for choosing Tanais over Oxantes. But in terms of like using a more Greek name, I mean, you get the river, the Polytometus, the many honored river, but I don't think we know the non-Greek local name for that one in the sources. But yeah, certainly it's a bit different, like under the Seleucids, with the kind of more conscious making of a new Macedonia. But it's a good question. Do you have any place names in mind that you were thinking about?
I've always been wondering about Thebes in Egypt, for example. Why do we use a Greek name? Well, Hekatonpilos, we have a bunch of these. But I'm just trying to get into the heads of these people.
Yeah.
You are giving us like different model. You portrayed a different model than the one Twain is referring to. And
Well, yeah, I mean, okay, so I think there's
cognitive, models.
cognitive models, yes. I'm not sure that there was a similar kind of, you know, colonizing, naming practice that Alexander was consciously doing. There's some hints in like Eratosthenes and kind of other more fragmentary, there's some hints of that kind of propagandistic kind of colonizing element. And obviously naming everything Alexandria, and you know, that's pretty clear. Although he also named cities after his horse and his dog. So, you know, it's all about him really. But I think often, you know, one thing that gets underplayed in these kind of colonial imperialist contexts is just how simply it is to pronounce something. You know, I mean, Cuba is an indigenous name that did win out there over Juana, both relatively easy to pronounce, but you see this everywhere around the world. In New Zealand, you know, a ton of Māori names, where New Zealand where I'm from, a ton of indigenous Māori names survived through various, you know, through the British expansion of dominion. And we see this, of course, across America everywhere. So I think sometimes it's just convenience and like a well-established name. No one's gonna, you know, start adopting a new name sometimes.
I'm not exactly sure if I follow the two models. Can you just quickly explain those again?
I'm not sure what I mean, it's not my argument, but I would say one is to try to make something with the local name, maybe a hybrid, and the other is just ignore the local name and make it your own.
Yeah, okay.
Which
Yeah.
I think, I mean, testifies to a different state of mind, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, the hybrid names from Columbus's expedition, I think, are particularly interesting because I can't think of any examples from the Macedonian context of that kind of a hybrid other than local words that sound Greek enough to pass in Greek, like Tanais. So that is quite interesting, and I think more in the Roman context you get some examples of camps that are kind of, you know, named camp, indigenous name. But in the Macedonian context, I don't think we have the evidence. They may have existed, but it's good to look for them now. So, you know, I'm not sure how helpful that answer was, but yeah, thank you. Oh, yes, sorry.
Thanks. Could I try and extend this discussion, bringing into it Todorov? You know the scholar Todorov, the Bulgarian scholar?
Rings a bell.
Okay. He wrote about Columbus. He wrote about
Oh, yes.
the mental constructs, how we interpret his state of mind, you know, during his voyages, when he was trying to compare and contrast between different phenomena that he encountered in the New World, comparing it with the European scenery and, you know, the old world.
Can everyone turn off their mics if they're not speaking? Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
So
I don't know how to do that. So
רגע, מה? לא, זה המצלמה, אני לא רוצה לגעת בזה.
There's a volume. Can you just lower the volume knob here?
yeah. Will I be able to hear us?
okay. Yeah. Our natural tendency is to recognize things which are familiar to us, you know, and if they are not, if they are very strange to us, we try and name them differently to introduce into them something, a context which would make the association, you know, bring forward the association for us to be able to familiarize with them. So that's how Columbus, that's how Alexander, I think, were going about, you know, to the new places, to the new locations, and trying to familiarize themselves. And in a way, I wonder if, I don't know about Alexander's voyages, so I wonder if there are these kinds of phenomena which Columbus encountered, which he made himself, you know, produced himself mentally, concerning new
Yes.
appearances, new places, new
Yes.
situations, which he was trying, endeavoring to reinterpret in his own state of mind, according to his own state.
That's a great question. And it's been a while since I've looked directly at this material, I must admit, but from memory, because Columbus was convinced that he was in Asia, he would often hear indigenous names and project them onto a mental kind of Asian map. So for example, he thought that Cuba, I believe it was, sounded like Sipango, which I think was the name for Japan. So there were examples like this, absolutely. And you know, everything was determined by where's the gold, where's he heard about the gold. So yeah, and this absolute pre-existing mental map of Asia that he was projecting on the Indians. Absolutely.
Dylan, there are some questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask one?
Sorry. Sorry, Arab, it's really loud. 1 second. How's that?
Is that all right now?
One second. That's is that one? Off mic. That's on fold. That's fold. So that's
Okay, maybe.
Can you try now, Arab?
Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes,
Perfect.
do you hear me? Good, good. I think it's a fascinating subject because it actually has quite a lot of ramification once you look at the specific personalities involved as so-called guides. I think Sanjit Subramaniam has done a whole study of bilingual guides in Asia, and also to see how some of these people change their costumes and even their religion once they move from one side to the other, and doing it back and forth without any problem whatsoever. I also mentioned in the chat the book by Carter, The Road to Botany Bay, which is not about the Americas, but it is about Captain Cook and others, to see the process of naming as a process of controlling space or making places in an indifferent space and undifferentiated space, actually. And so the process of naming, which you also find in Greek mythology, all these itineraries of gods usually create the places as they name them. So that in and of itself is quite significant. The Greeks, I think, were aware of that. You get examples such as the attempt to found a colony in Sicily named after its mother city, Lindioi. It failed. It became Gela or Gela, which is a local name. So in the middle ground theory, which you mentioned, but I think you could actually enhance its applicability. I did that in the Returns of Odysseus quite widely. It's a very clever theory in the sense of these mutual misunderstandings that are created by guides and such encounters. The third culture that is so-called emerging is just as significant for the interpretation, both of the self and of the people you meet. With place names, you see, for example, the ending Bria or Brea. Think of Mesembria or the Athenian colony to Brea. That's another Greek name. That has something to do with the name city, perhaps in Thracian or something. So I think you're touching about a huge subject, actually. Of course, it'll be important to narrow it down and to focus it to your own specific question. But I think we should be aware how wide are the ramifications of the very process of naming while encountering new cultures and new spaces. Well, thank you very much. I think it's an excellent beginning for such a project, and we can talk about it more sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And it's certainly in the early phases of the research. So I'm looking forward to delving far more into middle ground theories and some others that have come out from more modern colonial contexts. Thank you. Oh, it's probably more, isn't it? A general question. How do foreign local guides and the way they're described in the sources compare to the descriptions of non-foreign local guides? For example, as mentioned by Pausanias in his tour of Greek towns and temples. Now, that's a good question, and it's something I will be exploring. So far, I've mainly just looked at foreign local guides, but I'm beginning to look at guides in the classical Greek historians, which of course also include Greek guides in other parts of the Greek world. But just as a preliminary thought, again, guides, we're beholden to the whims of the historians and their sources as to when they choose to mention them. And they typically choose to mention them when something goes wrong, or like I mentioned, they're often not mentioned in passing. I mean, they must have been present a lot more times than they are actually mentioned. But Pausanias is absolutely someone I would like to look at, and certainly I know people like Greta Hawes have been engaging a lot with the way that guides were engaging with the kind of storied mythical landscapes that Pausanias is dealing with. So there's a lot of that kind of complicity between employer and guide and here that I want to explore much more. And it's a very good question. It's an important element, is to compare the depiction of, as you say, foreign and non-foreign guides. So thank you for that. Donna asks, is there a study of conventions for presenting naming of places, people, etc., in this body of literature and the Greek tradition? Is there any literary or other conventionalization that may affect the assessment of this evidence? I'm thinking of parallels in scientific Greek texts. Conventions for naming places. Donna, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, I think writing the question, it takes all the sting out of it. And so I'm just going to say, first of all, thank you very much. And thank you to introducing to a non-historian the middle ground, which I'm going to now use in working on translations and translation of how we can look at translations to understand cultural transfer of certain things, which I'm looking at. So thank you for that as well, and for perhaps the third culture. Maybe I'll give later an example that I have from my work, but when you're doing naming, what you analyze the naming in your Mnemosyne article, and I don't know if naming, or how do you say, to frame the narrative of a naming, okay? Is the narrative of a naming framed the same in, I don't remember the source that you gave in the Mnemosyne article, or are there any like descriptions of naming in the Alexander romance and descriptions of naming in Aryan? Are they different in each of these genres? And how do you have to take account of this? And also in the diaros, and when you assess, their factuality, or is it like a trope? I mean, have you taken this into consideration? That's what I meant. And then the extension to this question, is there any similarity to how in the literature you're using, Alexander literature, and naming norms, or in say scientific, Aristotle, Galen, and I don't know if you can answer this now, but is it something I would love to talk to you about? It'll be useful to me also for my work.
Yeah, I mean, I guess all I can think of is what kind of Arad touched on with certain kind of naming conventions around descriptions of naming new colonies, and the politics of connections to divinities, local divinities, or Homeric heroes or whatnot. In terms of the Alexander sources, I'd have to really have a look at that. That's not something I've thought about too much. It's not something that's necessarily jumped out at me either.
You gave 3 references. I think it was from Arian, but you didn't give the Greek, you know, towards the end to show them. I would love to see how it's framed, for example.
Oh, you mean when the locals are
Yeah.
doing the names, you mean? We can go back to
I'll
that.
let you finish your sentence. I'm sorry.
Was it these ones back here? Yeah, okay. Oh, that's what you're talking about, right? So often there's talk about locals. So often it's just learning from the local people rather than from individuals. But I think that is sometimes we can see more clearly that, you know, an interpreter was involved, for example. But typically, at least in Arian likes to talk about generic locals, sometimes local barbarians.
I mean, even to the resolution, do they say hoti or do they say hos? Is he saying they say more or less this, or this is exactly what they say? Are they? What's the commitment behind that?
I'm not sure that there's that kind of conventionality. I'd have to look at the Greek. Everyone's got the Greek on the handout. If there's anyone spotting any conventions there, but
well, we can discuss it later.
yeah, no, I mean it's a good question. It's an important question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. Perhaps a broader question on methodology and comparisons. I mean, how far are we willing to take this method? Is I don't know. Is Napoleon in Egypt still a youth, or the British in Afghanistan? Or
Yeah,
I mean, are there limits to this spectrum?
and that's a good question. That is something I'm needing to define and explore, because obviously I'm coming at it from Bosworth, who, you know, makes this Alexander and Cortes, you know, very different temporally and geographically. The more I kind of think about it, the more I think there's probably more value in comparing different times in the same geographical area, because you can see sometimes more typical, you know, trade winds or natural places of exchange that happen in certain regions. So I think that's probably where I'm going to end up focusing. So the Columbus stuff, it came from me reading Bosworth, and then also I just got really interested in reading the Columbus sources, and then that's what got me thinking a bit more about this kind of comparative material. So this is an early kind of foray, reflecting on the article and how this project actually developed from that article. So it's, you know, it's a very important question, I think, to define the limits of what kind of comparativism I'm using. And that's one of the reasons I'm hosting a conference in July, online conference, which you can all sign up to. It's called Illuminating Mediterranean Antiquity Through Comparative History, Theorizing Soft Approaches. I'm co-organizing that with a colleague in Swansea, and we want people to explore exactly this, the kind of theoretical limits of this methodology. You know, is comparative ancient history always going to be derivative? Are we always dependent on the trends of, you know, more modern theoretical developments like middle ground theory from, you know, in the American context? Can ancient history actually be generative here in this broader historical realm? So that's something that we want to explore, and that's one of the reasons I'm hosting that conference. So thank you.
I can imagine Columbus and one of his guides leaning over a map on his crossover, you know, and talking about the coastline and the other islands. But in the case of Alexander, I guess maps were less in use. What was the how did they talk about places and how far they have to go to another place, and other question is, can you say something about the very technique of exchanging information, keywords, names between both sides?
The technique, the kind of the actual.
Yes, writing down.
Right. Well, I mean, on in the Columbus diaries journals, it's mainly at least in the first instance, it's oral. So it's I mean, there's an example. So the person who transcribed Columbus's journals is Bartolome de las Casas, the critic of the atrocities in the New World, when he was writing his history of the Indies. And he talks about Columbus. He thought that an island name was Bohio. And apparently Bohio, Las Casas chastises Columbus because Bohio is actually just a word for house. So the local were pointing at the island saying there were big bohios, big houses there. And Columbus heard that and thought that island is called Bohio. So Las Casas is saying Columbus misunderstood the interpreter here. So you get these little hints of, pretty explicit descriptions of the oral confusion. In terms of Alexander, I mean, we do hear about some interpreters. So hermenes in Greek and interpretes in Latin. But what's interesting, one of the things I'm writing about at the moment is, so you've got the two big narrative sources that we have now, Arrian and Curtius Rufus. Arrian's writing in Greek 500 years after Alexander. Curtius is writing in Latin 400 years after Alexander. Arrian mentions interpreters, I think, twice. Curtius mentions them like 10 or 11 times. So you're very much dependent on the individual source and their interests in how much of the information they're transmitting from the original sources, because we don't actually have the primary sources for Alexander. We're dealing with a secondary tradition here, writing 300 years or more after Alexander with the narrative literary sources. But in terms of maps, that's a really good question. It's something I'd like to look into a bit more, because we do hear, I mean, there's a great passage in Herodotus when one of the Ionian Greeks is trying to convince the Spartans to come and help the Ionian revolt, throw off the shackles of Persia. And the Spartans are like, how far is it? And the guy describes how far it is. I think he points to a map from memory and shows how far it is. And the Spartans are like, no, thank you. That is too far to walk. So it's a very good question. And we do get, Xenophon's a really good resource for this, because he talks a lot about distances and how far they need to go, and they're dependent very much on local guides to work out how many parasangs they have to walk that day. But the physical maps side of things is a very interesting element, and we don't have a lot of evidence, I think, for this period at least. But I need to look more into that. So that's a great question. Thank you.
We were hoping to host Richard Talbot here 2 weeks from now, but it's safer times.
Yeah, that would be...
maybe next fall.
Thank you for your talk. Hope you can hear me.
You speak up a little bit. That's right. Yeah, sorry.
Is this better?
Yep.
Okay. So thank you for your talk, and I'm wondering if you are, or how are you going to deal with the question of credibility of guides? Because,
of guides?
Yeah, of guides, because when you were talking, and there was a question earlier, I was thinking about an example from the Palestine Exploration Fund. Coming here to Israel or the land of Palestine in the early 20th century, and you have again and again the same place names like Tel Sultan, which basically just means the mound of sherds, pottery sherds. But you can also see some sites that are plainly named Tel Khala, which basically means mound of ships. And you have to wonder if the local guide was just fed up that day, or he didn't know, and he was just playing a prank on
Yeah.
the people.
Absolutely.
And you also mentioned the Christianizing or paraphrasing Montezuma. And I'm wondering how if this is paraphrasing in order to prevent a conflict, or just paraphrasing in order to make it sound better to your Western ears.
Absolutely.
Something like that.
No, that's an absolutely central question. And this is kind of what Bosworth's getting at with this kind of creation of belief, because you get a situation like the city of Nisa, where the guides are telling Alexander, "Oh, Dionysus came here. Look, there's like his footprint there, or Heracles' footprint. I forget exactly.
Ivy.
Is it? Sorry?
Ivy.
Oh, there's ivy. That's right. There's ivy there. Look, Dionysus was here. He came through here." Because the guide said
That's classic tour guides.
exactly.
Making
Exactly. A bit different when you've got an army coming in, of course.
Yeah.
There's a more vested interest perhaps in learning what they're interested in and adapting to that. So there's absolutely, this is an aspect of the kind of middle ground. What you're dealing with, and I think the power dynamics aspect is key. And one of the things I was getting at was, how much can we, how does the status of that guide affect the information they're giving? If they're feeling threatened, then there's all sorts of elements that are going into there. And as much as you can, I like to reconstruct the agency. What they're actually, what power they do have in that situation, which is often quite little. But I think it's a really central question, and thank you for that. Thank you, Arad, for the various references here as well. These are really central. And Arad's work
Copy these and send them to yourself or something. Document it before they-
does it delete it, does it?
I'll have to save on my.
Okay.
You can save the whole chat.
Yes, I should say, Arad has been at the forefront of introducing middle ground theory into the Greek context, and Greg Wolfe has been central in doing that in the Roman context. So I'm very much standing on the shoulders of Arad and others. And I'm not the first to bring in middle ground in this context by a long shot. But thank you for that question.
So you talked already about thinking about what this part of history can generate in terms of methodology, probably in theory and such. And to ask about the expansion, in your project, what else are you going to look at? Do you have like I don't know, best case scenario, what you going to take from this and perhaps also offer to other other time periods?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think one of my most basic contributions will be gathering up all the kind of like what Donna was hinting at, the kind of framing conventions, the terminology used to describe guides across the Greek and Roman historical sources. What kind of contexts, certain terms are used in, what kind of, when are guides mentioned? Why are they mentioned? Why are they mentioned here, not here? And certainly, individual ancient historians have different interests, and I'm interested in looking at which ones, similarities in particular authors. And overall, I guess I'm interested in establishing more what's going on at the intersection of the kind of the initial individual context. We have a lot of knowledge about a lot of work done in recent decades on imperialism and kind of the long-term community effects. But I'm very interested in the kind of individual context at the start of these processes, as much as we can learn about them. Because the way that, these initial guide, conqueror contexts can happen, they can shape future, designs, imperial designs, future social relations, future cultural interactions. So I think we need to learn more about those interactions before we can fully understand the nature of the kind of ancient imperialism, I guess. And this is very much building off a lot of work on go-betweens and mediators and interpreters and guides in more modern colonial contexts. So there's been a whole spate of books in recent years. Jill was talking about one recently on these kind of go-between figures, mediating between cultures, and that. So I'm just kind of bringing that into the ancient context, which Bosworth was doing, but no one seems to follow up on so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Jill. Thank you all to the people, also to the people who joined us via Zoom.